So for those of you who are new to us, we are, of course, Irrational Labs. We've worked with hundreds of leading companies to create change using behavioral design. Our origin story starts with designing the first 25 plus BE teams at Google. Since then, we've run over 100 experiments for top companies: Apple, Microsoft, LinkedIn, Intuit, Optum, Walmart, Lyft, you name it. Hopefully we've worked with them if they're cool. But if you want to engage with us beyond this open event, we are a consultancy that does learning and development as well. So should your organization need help with product growth or consulting, or should you want community training in behavioral science, or just an AI and BE strategy sprint, please, please, please reach out to us. I would say a good email would be Shay at Irrational Labs today, or Amy at Irrational Labs, and we will get your queries up to our team. We also have an asynchronous behavioral design course. We have a general one, we have a finance one, and a health one, but they're not totally asynchronous. We have fellows giving you feedback on your homework. We have live events. We, of course, have the Ask Kristen Anything to help you with the course as you're going through it. And we have a Slack community that is all wrapped around this incredible course experience. Shay will share all the important links in the chat once we get the party started. But getting the party started starts now. Ladies and gentlemen, you are about to meet the one, the only Zarak Khan. Not only does he have incredible facial hair that makes normal guys like me jealous, but he's a really interesting behavioral scientist with experience generating and applying insights to organizational strategy, structure, product design, and public policy. He's been cited by McKinsey and Company as an expert in forging the future of behavioral science, and he divides his time across industry, academia, and philanthropy. Zarak is a behavioral science fellow at the University of Pennsylvania, where he teaches applied behavioral science consulting to graduate students. He also serves on the board of Action Design Network, which I feel like should be said Action Design Network, for a nonprofit community of over 20,000 practitioners and researchers interested in exploring the use of behavioral science and psychology in the design and development of products and policies that help people improve their lives. He graduated from Duke University and Stanford, the Sanford School. I was like, wait a minute, the Sanford School, with a Master of Public Policy degree. So, ladies and gentlemen, get your virtual hands bumping for our guest today, Zarak Khan.
Thank you so much, Ryan, and thanks everyone for being here. I've got to say, Ryan, that is like some of the best hype manning that I've seen in a really long time.
Thank you. I got a huge signing bonus when I came over here, like $2 million, just for that reason.
I think it's totally deserved. The second place I'll say is when I lived in DC. I was renting a house and our air conditioner broke one time, and the repair person came, and our landlord was like, okay, this is going to sound totally weird, but ask him to do his like announcer voice. And it turned out that he had been a boxing promoter. And so I asked him to do this, and it was like, it flooded the street. It was amazing. So this is giving me a chance to relive that a little bit. So thanks, Ryan.
Yeah, I will keep score after every round, and we'll let everybody know how you're doing based on no pressure at all.
Perfect. Well, so thanks everyone for being here. I see some friends in the audience here as well. So thanks for joining, and thanks to Irrational Labs for giving me time to talk about sort of an interesting topic that I don't get to talk about. In fact, this is the first time I've ever talked about it. So you guys are getting kind of the very first premiere of this. Normally, I'm talking about like how to build a behavioral science team. Which is great and useful, but a little bit dry. And you probably have heard lots of different versions of that. In fact, Kristen is an expert on that. She wrote a chapter about behavioral product managers for the book that we wrote on that topic. So life-changing decisions is something that I've been thinking about for a while, and appreciate a chance to have a venue to talk about it. So before I jump into any kind of slides and talk about, the research and tactics and that sort of thing, I first wanted to just share a little bit about like how I even started thinking about this. And so it started a couple of years ago. I was on, it's sort of a life-changing moment, I guess. I was on my honeymoon with my wife, and we were in Lisbon, and it was like the second or third week of our trip, and I woke up in like the middle of the night, it was like 3 a.m., like phone was ringing, and I was like, is everything okay? And she like answered the phone. She's like, yeah, it's fine. So I kind of fell back asleep, and I woke up, the next morning, and it's beautiful. I'm sitting on this balcony drinking coffee, and it was like such a nice setting that I'd almost forgotten. I was like, maybe I dreamt this the night before. And so I asked, like, hey, did you get like a phone call in the middle of the night? She's like, oh yeah, it was fine, but it was a friend of mine who wanted to kind of talk through a big life-changing thing. And so, I knew this friend as well, and there's somebody who's incredibly talented and already very successful, but not necessarily like super happy. And have been wrestling for a while with the idea of like, am I on the right track or not? And I have spent a fair amount of time with this friend, so I was like, wow, like they could just do anything. I mean, they're so smart and so talented and so charming, and they could sort of move into another field. They could do pretty much whatever they want. And so kind of casually, I just said like, they should just totally start over. They should just move to a different city, new profession, new kind of social group, and just sort of start up a new life. And I'm sure they would be successful and maybe happier. And normally, the moment would kind of pass you by, I think. But because we were just sitting there drinking coffee, kind of gave us a moment to sort of pause and think about it. I was like, but how do you actually even do that? It's like something that's pretty easy to say, I think, of like, oh, just like start over. But then in practice, it's pretty difficult. So that is kind of the genesis of this, or how it started. Right after that, this was when Omicron was like starting to peak in the US. And so instead of flying back to the States, I flew to the Azores, which is a small remote Portuguese island chain in the Atlantic. And I was there for a month just by myself. And so I had a lot of time to think about it. So that probably is what turned this into more of a project than just sort of like a single conversation. So with that background, I'll jump in and kind of share how we're thinking about life-changing decisions. So we have a research team that's been working on this for several months, just kind of putting together our approach, gathering research, pulling together sort of a framework for how do we think about this, and certain tactics that we think may be useful in making life-changing decisions. So I'm excited to share that with you all, and then I have a couple questions along the way for you too. So I think there'll be opportunity for some discussion here too. So let me share my screen here. All right. I think everybody should see life-changing decision slide. Is that right? Cool. So the first question I always get is, what even is a life-changing decision? And here is how we've defined it. So, a life-changing decision is, first of all, it is real life. So it's not just kind of a hypothetical sort of thought experiment. It's high stakes. So it's something that is a meaningful thing that requires some deliberation. So, there's not like a clear right answer, and you just sort of haven't made the shift yet. You're presented with some choice or set of options, and you really struggle to decide, what path you should choose or which option you should choose. It's personal to you, so it's not a decision that somebody else is making on your behalf or circumstances are making on your behalf, nor is it a decision that you're making sort of on behalf of somebody else. And then probably the one that's the most sort of, I think, confusing is it does not include like butterfly effect things. So this is the one where like right off the bat, people often have a question about. So it's not like, oh, did you take the train instead of the bus? And then you met this person on the bus or the train, and that's who became your, partner or something like that. That is serendipity, which happens all the time and is great, but it is not a life-changing decision that led to that. The other thing that I think is useful to sort of point out for behavioral science audience is that we're not really talking about habits or nudges here. So that's like a lot of what our background or training often is in like how do we change someone's habit around something? How do we nudge somebody into a decision here? So, you're not going to get defaulted into one of these life-changing decisions, and this is something that requires like your active participation. And it may result in some habit change, but that's not necessarily what we're talking about in terms of changing habits. And then finally, who's the target audience for this research? The story that I shared about our friend is kind of like who the target audience is. So someone who's relatively happy, relatively successful, things are pretty stable, but they feel in some way that they could be happier. They may have been thinking about making a change for a while, but can't seem to sort of take action on it. And I wanted to draw a distinction between that and other scenarios or situations where you would say, well, this is life-changing. Things like, addiction or dealing with abuse. Partly those are areas where, if we go back to our original criteria, you could argue there is a clear right answer of sort of not, being in these situations. And so you're often are starting from that as a perspective. And then there are other areas where there's more robust sort of research around how these things happen and the support mechanisms you may employ. So with that sort of lead in, I'll open up our first poll question here, which should not require too much deliberation on your part. And the first question is, have you ever made a life-changing decision? And all right, thanks, Shay. The answers are flooding in. You will not be surprised that there is a clear front runner here. All right, 74% participation. We'll end it there because we have a clear winner, which is yes. Unsurprising, I think. 91% of people say yes. 9% of people say maybe. One person said no. This is the first no we've ever gotten. It's interesting. So yeah, this tracks with what we've seen so far in some of our research. Now, a more nuanced question, maybe, when you think back about a significant life-changing decision, what was the impact of that decision? So let's open up our second poll here. Again, I think unsurprisingly, it takes a little bit longer to think about this one. But we're closing in on our participation rate from last time too.
No pressure, but I respect that you're keeping score. That's very analytical of you. And we're 2 percentage points down. Respond.
I think we'll close it here. And so yeah, so this also tracks, I think, with what we've seen so far. So we see the bulk of people say eventually positive, 44%, another 13% immediately positive, 37% had some sort of mixed outcome or impact, 5% it was eventually negative, so it's 7 people, and then 1 person where it was immediately negative. So I'll maybe invite you to share maybe something that you're comfortable sharing. So, we've got a group of people here, so nothing that you're uncomfortable with, but maybe somebody from the immediately positive group. What was the decision that you were faced with? And if you're waiting for somebody else, they're not the person that's going to raise their hand, it's you. right. Well, since that was a smaller group, I'll move down to eventually positive, where we had 64 people. Somebody who eventually positive, life-changing decision.
Hey, Zarak, this is Brad here. I'll go. Ours was adoption. So we chose to adopt a child, and one of those where eventually very positive, but just like anything with a big decision like that, not easy at the beginning.
Yeah. What was the what were some of the like hurdles or barriers that you faced as you were sort of thinking about the decision, not necessarily logistical barriers of like going through the process, but were there sort of, behavioral barriers or mental barriers that you, as you were thinking about doing it?
Yeah, I think one would just be, expansion of the family. Was one. The other one, and this may be more tactical than what you're looking for, was just a financial barrier.
Yeah.
The other one was international adoption. So just considerate of barriers, for the child in terms of experiencing a different country. Just a few examples.
Yeah, no, those are great. I think it's also interesting that this one was sounds like to some extent a joint decision that you were making with a partner as well. So that's a great example. Anybody else in this eventually positive category have one a decision that they like to share?
I can share too.
Great, thank you.
All right, my name is Shang. I grew up in China and then went to college in China. And then for the graduate school, I had options, in terms of pursue continue in China or go to Australia, UK, or US. So eventually I came to US. Actually, I almost went to Australia, even received scholarship from some top universities, but that was quite I would say, life-changing decision. I switched to US, and of course, the very beginning was very difficult. I didn't know anyone here, and my English was not that good. So it was very, very, very tough. And just brand new country, and I had no exposure. And I came from a very small place in China, so I never heard anyone being abroad. Like my family members, most people I knew, grew up with, they never even left the state, the province. So no mention going. So anyway, so eventually, of course, it's very different life. It's kind of like the movie. Have you seen Everything Everywhere at Once? It's like,
I love that movie.
I know, like imagine if I didn't go, like my whole life would be very different. I won't be able to maybe attend this seminar from you.
Right. Yeah. So do you, and it's interesting, the barriers that you sort of mentioned there are ones that we've seen other people have kind of shared as well, related to the same kind of idea of moving for university. And so do you think, I mean, you mentioned Everything Everywhere All at Once. Do you think back on, if you had chosen this other path, that you had another option in Australia, what your life might have been like?
Yeah, I think probably would be very different, particularly in terms of career-wise. I wouldn't say like definitely in terms of opportunities, particularly what I do in tech, startup, and then I think there were definitely way more opportunities in the States. So I think in terms of professional-wise, the career development might be very different.
Yeah. I like how you describe that. That's often how I think about it as well, is like different, not necessarily better or worse, which is sort of hard to guess and sort of not necessarily useful to imagine. So thanks for sharing that. I'll move down to the mixed category. If anyone has something, we had 53 people here. So anyone that's willing to share a decision that they faced that had sort of a mixed impact.
I'll speak up and share.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm Lisa. I'm made the decision to purchase a home instead of continuing to rent. which was great in one end, but the other we're dealing with just like the headaches of HOA and insurance increase and neighbors and all that kind of stuff. So it's yeah.
Totally. Yeah, no, totally. That one resonates with me for sure, and is something that I think is often cited in like the research on like spending money and happiness. Is like buying homes is one that's kind of sort of mixed results, or maybe I'll say there's ways of doing it that lead to higher happiness. But yeah, you often in the process you don't necessarily anticipate the negative aspects or the fees or the repairs or HOA and that sort of thing. And so when those pop up, those are things that kind of stick with you for the life of the home, even after the immediate sort of, moving in glow wears off.
Yeah.
Let's see. Is it Sarah?
Yes, that's correct pronunciation, and it's a good change to have. Thank you. So here's my pickle. Right now, I'm a consultant for a company for the last 1.5 years.
Mhm.
And for the last 5 months, we've been negotiating me switching to an internal role within the company.
Mhm.
So it's a huge change because I've been 7 years working as a consultant, and now I'm going to be a employee and also a member of a bigger team. But I'm really concerned about the culture of the company and the maturity. It's a product company, so the product maturity of the company is a big concern.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if I should accept it or try to go out on my own and make it in this tough economical situation with the current market and everything in tech. So that's my stuff.
Yeah, that's an interesting one because it's a current one that you're facing right now. So how are you thinking about making this decision? What's your approach as you wait?
Well, I mean, partly I'm talking about in therapy because there's a lot of fears that comes with it, right? We all have different kind of responsibilities. So I'm thinking about being moderate about them, taking them into the calculation. But I also would like to make a choice that is more future oriented rather than a problem solving thing in this, this year, let's say. But it's a hard one. And personally, I'm challenged. So I'm also looking for some inspiration. Also, I'm doing some coaching for designers. And I think this is a common theme between designers to how that stiffness and being able to say no is a bit hard for us. And so I would like to use the information on my coaching as well.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, we will talk in a little bit about a couple of the tactics that we're sort of testing out to see what the impact looks like. And you've touched on some of these already, so I like your approach to thinking about sort of the future, not necessarily just immediately right now or this year, and then the approach of kind of getting input and doing this kind of coaching is great as well. Lynn, I see your hand up as well. Lynn, you're still muted if you're talking. Okay, maybe it was an accidental hand. So let's see. I'll also open it up to anyone who had sort of a negative impact, whether that was eventually or immediately. We had very few people here, so I don't feel like you have to sort of identify yourself if you would like to remain. Yeah. Oh, Lynn,
can you hear? Yeah, I'm on my phone, and for some reason, like the things are coming up weird. Anyhow, I knew I was muted. I couldn't unmute. So I put the mix down. I've made several major decisions, life impacting, marriage, divorce, major relocations, things like that. And I guess and those used to be really hard for me because I'm kind of like a recovering perfectionist, and they only got easier when either I just sort of said, okay, everything has pros and cons, and I just have to accept that and make the best decision and feel confident that I can, whatever the outcome is, and believe me, some of these outcomes I could not have predicted, I can handle, right? That it's that like, it's not going to kill me kind of thing, right? Or be the end of the world. And that's sort of the direction that I give my children when they're struggling with their big decisions. It's like, you know, when there's no clear choice, it's their pros and cons. And what did I learn in decision analysis? Just because it doesn't turn out right doesn't mean you didn't make the best decision at the time. So that's kind of my thinking. I still say, like, yes, you know, over time, maybe it's shifted more towards eventually positive, because I say, well, if I look at the negatives, some of those in some ways led to positives, but I still think on the whole, I'd have to say mixed.
Yeah. I mean, so you touched on a bunch of things that we're thinking about, and that'll show up in a couple slides here, where one of the things we're thinking about and sort of measuring is personality traits. And so you kind of mentioned, well, being a perfectionist is kind of a piece of this. We're looking at tactics around, you know, increasing your own sort of self-confidence and feelings of self-efficacy, which is, as you say, like, you've navigated this before and you've been successful, you know, and you're competent in doing that. And so that's going to continue to be the case when you face this in the future. So yeah, I love the stuff you touched on there. Eric, we'll go to you, and then we'll keep moving.
Sounds good. So essentially, I quit a job that was really great. I was working for a very, very large financial institution, and I was burning out. People didn't talk about burnout or the need for vacations or sabbaticals and things like that. It was just not heard of at the time. So I went running for a crazy job that would just give me anything that was the opposite of what I was in. And I did it without a whole lot of thought, I guess. But I mean, you know, it was not a good decision, and I ended up regretting it. And regret's a big piece of now what's affecting me. But you know, the bigger thing is that I'm now unable to take risks. So you know, I'm always sort of looking at every decision I have going forward and saying, well, you made a bad decision, and have you thought this through? And you know, it's analysis paralysis, which is terrible for people in our field, but just the same. So that's sort of my contribution to this is that there's the regret piece of this and avoiding future regret, as well as also you know, probably avoiding risk to some extent.
So fear of uncertainty or risk has been the highest response in terms of like a barrier that prevents people from making a life-changing decision. Has so far been the top response. So you're in good company there. The notion of doing sort of a, you know, avoiding future regret is a tactic that we're testing as part of this research. So I think that there is an opportunity there to sort of try to frame things in ways, you know, often in the short term, we may regret doing something. You know, I said this thing, I regret saying it. A lot of that stuff tends to fade away in our memory. And in the long term, you end up regretting inaction, the things where I should have just tried this, you know, when I had the opportunity. The other thing that jumps out to me from your story is in Annie Duke's book, Quit, it might have been a quote from Richard Thaler, but she talks about like making, you know, obviously her area of expertise and focus is decision making. And she talks about a lot of people basically wait until it's not a decision anymore. You wait until circumstances sort of dictate that, because there isn't really like which option is better. This option is now kind of like the only option, or it feels like the only option, because the circumstance that I'm in has eroded to the point where, you know, it's kind of unbearable. And that's I heard sort of echoes of that in the story that you shared. So thanks, everyone. That was interesting to hear everyone's stories, and it's kind of validating also just in sort of how we've been thinking about this. So I'll move us along here for the sake of time, but we'll have more opportunities to kind of keep chatting as well. So one of the first things that we did was we wanted to sort of understand what's the process to make a life-changing decision. And so, we looked at, there's lots of different frameworks, and sort of models of how people make choices. And we sort of married together several into one that we thought made the most sense for what we're looking at. And you'll probably see similarities to ones that you either used before or familiar with. And so, they're, to some extent, these are all relatively similar, but we said that really the first part is awareness. So, this can be, I think of it as like something kind of in the back of your mind that's like, something could be a little bit better, I think, or I just have never been totally satisfied with some aspect of my, with a job or a relationship or where you live or something like that. At a certain point, that awareness like builds and builds to where you actually start exploring other options. So in the research around relationships, like what this might look like is, if you're in a relationship and you're thinking about ending that relationship, you might start spending more time, out with single friends. You might start going out, doing like solo travel and stuff by yourself. You're not doing anything unethical. You're not doing anything that sort of breaks any sort of rules that you may have set with your partner. But you're essentially kind of trying out and saying, well, this is kind of the type of thing I would be doing if I were single. Is this, when I go out and try this, does this feel right or not? It can also be mental, right? So it doesn't have to be like you're actually physically going out and doing things. It can just be sort of almost a thought experiment of, I'm imagining it's 6 months in the future and I've made this decision. Like, how do I feel about that? So you're exploring these different options or choices in order to form some kind of intention around it. So, this intention is where you have said, I think I've made a decision about what I want to do. And now I'm going to take some action towards that. Most of our work, I think, as behavioral scientists, or at least sort of my training that I was kind of brought up in, is really focused on this piece here of like the intention action gap. And so that's something that probably a lot of you have spent time thinking about and probably actively do work on. We have thoughts around tactics and stuff that you can try for this, but we didn't want to neglect these other steps as well. And then for some decisions, you have to sustain them into the future, right? So there are some where it's kind of a one-way door. You've walked through and you can't really walk back in again and start something back up. But then, of course, we all know someone who's like broken up and gotten back together with the same person like 40 times. And so we might just say, well, okay, you're having trouble sustaining this decision. And maybe even to the extent where this is really just sort of exploration for you. So for some things, you have to sustain these decisions. Sometimes the decision itself is kind of self-sustaining. So I'll share some of our preliminary data that we gathered. So we often will pre-test things with our lab before we send them out into the field. And so this is, a very small sample, but you'll see echoes of some of the conversations that we had a moment ago in what we've found here. So we also asked, hey, have you ever made a life-changing decision? Again, this is very close to what we saw in our poll here. Basically, everybody said yes or maybe. In this instance, the people who said maybe, it was often like a life stage event. And so, they were like, well, it was a life-changing decision because I had to choose what university to go to. And, I'm not sure if I count this as life-changing because I kind of just felt like I was on this path already. We sort of went through and categorized based on qualitative responses what types of life-changing decisions people had made. What this data really shows that this reflects the life stages of the folks that we spoke with. So most of these people are early career. And so some of the biggest life-changing decisions were where to go to school. So that's what you see kind of dominating the responses here. You also see, ending relationships. Interestingly, you don't see starting relationships. changing jobs, changing cities or countries, and deciding to start a family. We then asked people, what were the biggest challenges of making this decision? And again, you'll see a reflection of some of the comments that folks here on the call have made. So the biggest one, it was just, I don't know the impact of this, right? So it feels like kind of a gamble. That's very, very similar to the orange one here, risk of failure. Really, the only distinction is that they specifically thought that there was like a higher risk of failure, as opposed to just, I'm not sure what will happen. Or like, I'm going to try something and I think I could fail. Some decisions required like some learning to actually make a choice. Like I need to go learn a lot about the options before I could make a decision. In some cases, I don't think I heard this one in the conversation so far, but it felt like a conflict with their identity. So I've always thought of myself as a lawyer, and I decided to go and start a vineyard or something like that. And how do I now think about myself and define myself? So where there are elements of their identity that they felt that they were either giving up or changing in some way. And then new location adjustment. So this was often moving for school, moving to a new country. That was sort of what fell into this category here. And then impacts. So again, very similar to what we saw in our poll. So most people report a positive impact. In this case, it was a little bit flipped towards immediate as opposed to later. And then we had a big group of people who reported mixed impact as well. In most cases here, the mixed impact was something like, I ended a relationship, and so it was painful, but also the right thing to do. Or actually, the most common response that fell into this category was having children or starting a family. And so it was like, well, this was like, I think a lot of the people who filled it out had just had children too. And so it's like, they're great. I'm excited about it, but also it's like, it's so much work, and it's, there are things that are obviously very, very challenging about it too. And then lastly, we asked people, do you currently feel like you need to make a life-changing decision? And so, over half of people just flat out said yes. And then most of the other people said maybe. Only 10% or so said that they didn't. And I think those are the people who just had kids. So there's a lot of interesting things, I think, in there. Again, it's preliminary, but here are the things that sort of jump out to me. So one, pretty much everybody feels that they've made a life-changing decision. That's not necessarily super surprising, but it's kind of surprising then to think like, well, why isn't there more sort of higher quality guidance around this if everybody does it? Most people felt that they needed to make another one. So I kind of put the maybes in the yes category here. I think that you're often at a different phase of the decision making. You're not at the point of like choosing something, but you're sort of in the buildup of maybe that awareness stage. So that's like 90% of people from our first little preliminary survey. So that's a lot of people. Very interestingly, nobody in this survey, and then very few people in our poll, reported a purely negative outcome. And then just a reminder, this was a very small, non-random sample. It's our lab, people there are probably relatively successful, that sort of thing. But still, it's interesting to see then that there is like a clearly kind of dominant, impact, which is for the most part, like, mixed to positive. Most of it's positive. And still everybody feels that they need to make another one, but they haven't done it yet. The other thing that I thought was interesting is that most of the choices that people, or the decisions that people report, are active choices with agency. It kind of reinforces our criteria when we think about what actually is a life-changing decision. So, people ending a relationship, that's an action that changed their lives. Sort of the slow start to a relationship, nobody, or that's less often something that somebody would point out. So then what's our goal? Our goal with this work is to identify strategies and tactics that help people make more proactive decisions, which result in higher life satisfaction. So we look at the research and see, well, okay, it seems like people are reporting positive changes in their life satisfaction from making decisions. It also seems like people wait too long to make decisions sometimes. It doesn't necessarily mean, and we've been pretty careful to kind of say that this doesn't mean that we're explicitly encouraging people to always make big changes. It's a totally acceptable outcome to intentionally recommit to wherever you're currently at, right? And oftentimes these life-changing decisions are, do I stay in the current path or do I change to something else? But what we're trying to avoid is, or we're trying to help people avoid is, you're in a situation that you're sort of unhappy with and you stay there for what feels like too long, when you could have made a change and potentially had more agency in making that change, and felt better about it. So then, going back to this question in Lisbon of well, how do you actually even do that, right? There's a lot of influences there, and there's a lot of tactics that you could potentially choose from. Here's just sort of a very broad overview of the things that we think influence these life-changing decisions. Some of these have already come up, either you've seen it in the survey responses or it's come up in the conversations that we've been having here. This is also the part of the presentation where you see all the different things I've been reading, that mostly fiction or poetry or something like that, that sort of highlights some aspect of this. So, elements of our identity and how we think about ourselves likely impacts our ability to make life-changing decisions. And I say impacts because I don't know that it's necessarily hinders or helps. I think it could do either. So thinking of yourself, adopting sort of a new identity or self-perception may help you make a life-changing decision or move into or sustain a life-changing decision. The second one, and Lynn kind of talked about this in her comment about sort of personality or being a perfectionist. These are things that we're not necessarily going to change somebody's personality, right? But there are likely certain tactics that are more or less beneficial based on sort of the type, your personality. And so we also find, this is a paper that actually just came out in January, that people's life satisfaction is pretty consistent with their personality traits. And satisfaction these are relatively stable things that actually shape our satisfaction. So they find that emotional stability, extroversion, and conscientiousness are correlated with life satisfaction. Less so openness and agreeableness, but I'll be interested to see if openness is correlated with likelihood of making a life-changing decision, which you could sort of reasonably have a hypothesis that it would be. This one is one that was the top item in our survey. Eric talked about it as well. It's kind of there's risk involved with this, right? And so there's sort of fear of the unknown. We want certainty when we're making decisions. One way of getting certainty is waiting so long that, you're pretty sure that the alternative is going to be better because, the status quo has become so bad. I really like Jeanette Winterson. This is a quote from one of her books. I've noticed that doing the sensible thing is only a good idea when the decision is quite small. For the life-changing things, you must risk it. So there is some element of risk likely that's involved with this, and that may be mitigated by other things, right? So Brad mentioned, there's financial aspects to it and logistics, right? So that's one of the things that we're looking at are basically your income level. Does that help basically de-risk some of these things for you? Loss aversion. So anyone who's ever worked on like a even just kind of corporate change management type of campaign knows that like people have a hard time letting go of stuff, even if it's like not very good. It's like, hey, we're introducing a new tool. It's going to make things better and easier. And people are like not happy about it because it's just a change, right? And before, you know, a change can be something beneficial, you're losing something. You're losing routine. You're losing familiarity. And so that's one of the things that we think might be impacting like why people delay these decisions. This was an interesting paper from Stephen Levitt, where they basically had participants flip a digital coin. And they would kind of come to the coin and say, hey, I've got these options. Okay, flip it, heads or tails. And heads, you know, you go with option A, tails, option B. People who made a change, whether or not the coin told them to. So in some cases, they disobey the coin and make a change. People who made a change reported being happier 2 months later and 6 months later. People who where the coin told them to make a change, they were more likely to make the change. So it kind of means we think that that's an indication, well, they sort of had this in their mind all along. This was just a thought experiment that basically helped them get from that exploration through intention and action. And so, you know, people may be just excessively cautious when they're facing these types of decisions. You know, sort of related to loss aversion, we think that routine plays a role in this. You know, you're just familiar with what your life and sort of the status quo looks like. You might be familiar with this paper that looked at commuting behavior in London during and after a strike on the tube. And so people were basically forced to find new routes. So they were kind of forced to abandon their routine, and that forcing mechanism prompted, you know, a significant number of those people to actually switch to a new routine altogether. And in this case, it was actually a more optimal routine for them. I'm moving a little bit more quickly here just because of for the sake of time. So social networks and relationships. This is something that I think was like one of the first things that we thought of. You know, people are, you know, oftentimes it's hard to leave because like, well, that's where your friends are, that's where your family is. You know, you've got close coworkers, things like that. So how do you build new networks, and how do you potentially prune networks that, you know, are going to be a barrier to a change that you want to make? And then finally, like location and timing, right? So this kind of gets to the logistics piece of it. But it's likely that, you know, just our environment itself makes some things easier. And so we're thinking about this in terms of liminal spaces. So are there sort of natural moments of receptivity to making a change? So, you know, Katie Milkman has done research on fresh start moments. I think there are also like kind of these bigger like life stage changes. So, you know, we've already heard in conversation here, graduation, you know, sometimes it might be something like retirement, or a job is ended. You know, might be kind of voluntarily leaving or burnt out. A key relationship is kind of shifted in some way. So these are things that you don't necessarily have control over, right? So are there ways that we can kind of intentionally create these liminal spaces that help people make decisions? Okay, so these are all sort of like behavioral elements that we're thinking about and trying to measure. And then some tactical interventions that we think could be helpful in making life-changing decisions. These are basically tactics that we're testing out with a representative sample of the US population to see, is there, you know, are these more or less beneficial for moving people through this decision-making process? And does it work better or worse for people with like certain personality types or that type of thing? So more kind of demographic characteristics. These are things that several people actually mentioned already when they shared their stories. So one is what we're calling a psychological needs checklist. So, you know, often when you're doing sort of a pros and cons list, you just sort of look at like very observable, like easy to compare things. You're saying that you should also think about, well, what are the psychological needs that whatever your current status quo is providing you? And then how are you going to meet those needs after making a change or contemplating a change? This one we talked about sort of self-confidence boosting, right? So, hey, you've navigated this before. Almost everybody said that they've made a life-changing decision before, and most people have said it worked out at least relatively well, right? Mixed to positive. So you have experience doing this, and you've probably done a pretty good job. So that's some confidence that you can probably take into the your next decision. Something that we're calling a pro-mortem, a credit to Alyssa Lampert, one of our research assistants who came up with this title. So this is basically thinking about what's the sort of benefits that that a change might make when you think out into the future. And does envisioning sort of an ideal situation increase your confidence or your likelihood of making a change? Regret avoidance. So we talked about this a little bit with Eric. So thinking about future regrets and avoiding future regrets, is that a way to help somebody kind of move from intention to action? Again, action not necessarily being shifting, but it can still be sort of recommitting, but you have some intentionality behind it. Kill criteria. I'll give Annie Duke credit. This was one from her. Does setting up some specific decision-making criteria help move people? So, how would you know that this is the right decision for you? And when would you know that by? So sort of building this out for yourself means that you don't necessarily stay in this limbo period for too long. I just mentioned these sort of liminal periods. How can you set aside time to do this kind of exploration that might move you towards an intention? And then finally, we're just looking at how these things map to personality traits and other kind of demographic factors. So how this will evolve, first is expanded research on how people make life-changing decisions. So this is the study that we're fielding now. And we also have opportunities for you all to kind of participate in this too, if you're interested. Generating essays on theory. So, as we learn more about what are the specific elements that we think are either helpful or barriers here, kind of expanding on that a little bit through explanation. Collecting stories from people. So I think oftentimes it's more powerful to sort of hear someone's personal story about making a change. So we're collecting these stories and then curating a list of, okay, well, what are the activities that we think, these tactics is, I guess, the word I used before, that you can use to actually take action or to sort of move through this process yourself. So we didn't want to just kind of throw these out willy-nilly. We're sort of doing this first by kind of testing it out to see what the impact, sort of self-reported impact is. But these are sort of the next steps for us. And if you want to join, we would love to have you. You could help by, one, just telling us about a life-changing decision you've previously faced. And then if you're currently facing a life-changing decision, we're interested in hearing about that too. And you can you can kind of pick and try one of the tactics that we had listed here. So we have, these things are links here. And so I'll put the links in the chat, or I'll send them to Irrational Labs to share out with the group of folks who registered here. But that is what we're up to next. Thank you all so much for sharing your stories, for joining me for part of your Friday, and for your attention. And with that, I will turn it back over to our MC extraordinaire, Ryan.
Yeah, Zarak, could you go back to the tactics slide? Because I think some people wanted to scoop that. And it clicked out really quick for the sake of time. So
sure.
Yeah, that would be awesome. And while you do that, we don't have tons of time left, but we do have tons of questions coming in. So we will do our best here to give you some of our most exciting questions, Zarak. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
All right, I'm going to go to the ones that are a little clearer to read, but somebody asked, well, specifically Rebecca Wilson in Edinburgh, she said, I'm still confused as how some of the examples given are not the butterfly effect, e.g. university acceptance could be serendipity. Keen to understand what the importance of the delineation is. Does the start of a relationship involve some level of serendipity? Interesting clarifying question.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the way that I think about that is, when you make so I would say that the life-changing decision, right, is you might, well, first of all, people can, to some extent, they define them for themselves, right? But oftentimes, like choosing a university, people think of as a life-changing decision. It puts you in a new environment where other sort of serendipitous interactions are just more likely to occur. I think this is probably true for if you move to a new city, you take a new job, and you move to a new country or something like that. You're outside of your normal sort of environment, social network, friend group. And so there are things that are challenging about that, right? But it sort of makes it way more likely that other things are going to sort of happen to you, or you are going to encounter. So I think that you're right, that there probably is not like you can't necessarily parse out and say, well, this thing had no other impacts, right? What I meant by the butterfly effect thing is, one of the questions that we ask people is, how many life-changing decisions do you think you've made? I won't share our like responses so far, I guess, because if anyone here takes the survey, you'll have the opportunity to fill it out. But it's pretty clear that some people are like thinking of specific decisions, right? And so they're kind of building up in their mind. They're like, oh, well, this, and they sort of work their way up to like, 5 decisions or 7 decisions or something like that. And then other people are like, oh, I feel like I make these all the time, like hundreds, thousands. And so, I think that those folks in that latter category are often including kind of like butterfly effect things, meaning like the decision itself was not significant. So deciding to like move to a new city, go to a new school, like that's a fairly significant decision that might lead to other significant decisions. Butterfly effect would be an insignificant decision that might lead to something significant, but you didn't anticipate it in that way. But I understand that it's like a sort of tricky one.
That's excellent. So some of these questions are, we're going to do one more because unfortunately we're at time. I'm going to go with Randy in Minneapolis has an interesting question that I'm going to parse a little bit here. Well, he's basically interested to see how coming out to friends and family would fit or change the framework. So this is an interesting case study, I suppose.
Yeah. I mean, I think that I'm sort of imagining here because this is not an experience that I've had, but I'm thinking that like there's probably you have some level of like exploration here, right? Awareness, maybe like you're kind of thinking, well, okay, I think this is something that I might want to share, or that in some ways, maybe I feel like I have to share at some point. And you might start exploring that, kind of testing the waters in some way, right? You maybe start sharing it with friends, sharing it with other people. There are maybe some people that you hold in reserve where you're like, I am not ready yet. And then at some point you form some intention around doing it. And then there may be even a long period between forming that intention and actually taking the action of telling somebody or coming out to them. I don't know. I'd be open to the thoughts of the group here on this too.
Yeah.
So I mean, I can fit into that framework, but I don't know that other people would agree.
Yeah, it was interesting. So I thought I'd ask that. You can look at the other questions when we wrap. They're on this Google Doc here. And
cool.
Should you want to respond, please feel free. People can leave their windows open. I will tell you, Zarak, an interesting thing. Personally, I had my large intestine removed. And at the time, I did not need to make that decision. I had a disease that wasn't going in remission, but the doctor said something similar to what you said. He said, most people make these decisions too late. You want to be proactive. At a high risk of colon cancer, he's like, we want to get this out before it is too late. So, and I kind of remember that advice very vividly. And yeah, that's one decision you don't want to have to be forced to make down the road.
Totally.
So
yeah, I've got several folks with similar kind of stories in mind that I think are good candidates to sort of share here, where it's like, yeah, this was a difficult, in some cases, difficult decision that you proactively made to sort of have more agency over it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you are getting lots of wonderful compliments in the chat here. So thank you again, Zarak, for your time, genius, insight, energy, and incredible beard. All of the things are true. We are so thrilled to have spent time with you today. Please give him a virtual round of applause. Or you can always come off. Yeah, you can unmute and give him a huge round of applause too. We like live sound effects while it's just me. But again, I did post in the chat, come take a course with us at Irrational Labs, collaborate with us. I dropped our 3B framework and one of our favorite blogs, the top 10 behavioral science books of all time. Zarak, go forth and prosper in North Carolina. And to everybody, we will see you next month for September's excitement. Stay tuned as those invites will drop soon. Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.